I'm a philosopher. My brother is a mechanical engineer. And so, on the one hand, there were sort of stereotype jokes. So, jokes about me having my head in the clouds. But at the same time, others of those jokes came because those people know me better than anyone else. Right. And so there are some jokes that are deeply cutting in ways that only the people who love you the most could tell. Right. I'm a slow driver, so they say that Amish people give me the finger. So the idea is that there does seem to be an ethical angle to these sorts of insult-based jokes. And yet, if you look at the sort of standard approaches to humor ethics, none of them seem to be able to really speak to that sort of interpersonal ethic. And so what that led to is a new theory of humor ethics, and that's what we'll be chatting about now. Well, it's what I'll be chatting about now. I have no idea what you guys are doing here. So thus the name, humor ethics, and joke capital, how to win friends and insult people. So to start by just sort of framing the question, we can begin with Freud, who distinguishes between innocent jokes and tendentious jokes, right? The innocent jokes, just wordplay, puns, right? Not terribly philosophically interesting in this way. It's the tendentious jokes, right? Dirty jokes and ethnic jokes, which Freud points out actually is the largest part of our humor. That's where the ethical question appears, right? Is it morally acceptable to tell and enjoy tendentious jokes? That's the interesting question. Now, in order to, we'll begin by sort of setting out the landscape. And the easiest way to sort of structure it is metaphorically based on Aristotle's picture. So, for those of you who aren't philosophers, Aristotle's ethics contends that the morally right way to be is the moderate path. If there's too much or too little, that's a vice, but moderation, that's where virtue is. And he makes this claim with respect to humor. He says that someone who is humorless is a bore, someone who engages in humor too often is a buffoon. Neither of those are desirable. It is, and some of us were at a wonderful talk about this term in the last session, the proper way to be is moderate, to be witty. Now, we'll use this as sort of a structure, but because it does come with this sort of loaded language, it does sort of beg the question. So let's change the terminology slightly. So the boorish ethical position, we will term the cultural sensitivity position. And these are the people who want to argue that tendentious jokes are inherently morally problematic. One should not tell these jokes. These jokes should be off limits, period. Right? Why? Well, there's a range of different arguments that are given, right? One is that being the target of a joke is a harm. It's bad to harm people, so therefore you shouldn't tell these jokes. Others, and you find this more in more contemporary versions of this position, we live in a world in which there are unequal distributions of social power. What do these jokes do? They tend to play on stereotypes. Those stereotypes then further entrench the unjust distributions of social power. So while you think you're just, getting laughs, what you're actually doing is ossifying these harmful social structures. Others base it on the notion of offense, that is, causing offense shuts people down, keeps them out of the discourse. And so the idea is that these are just jokes that shouldn't be told. What's important for us, and what we're going to see, is that while Tom and I will disagree with all of these positions, there's a reason why smart people held them, right? There are insights to all of these pieces that we really would want to keep in a larger synthetic account. And so what you look at here is that those who hold the cultural sensitivity position, they argue that what is the object of moral, in this case, condemnation, is the joke itself. It's the joke that is morally problematic. So the tellings of the joke are the tokens, but it's the joke itself that is the type. And it is that object, the joke, the script, which is the object of moral judgment. And so for them, they're not looking at who tells the joke. They're not looking at why you told the joke, when you told the joke. That joke is itself problematic. And so what we're going to see is, well, of course, things are probably a lot more complicated. And that takes us to the other extreme, which we'll term neo-Shaftesburyanism. So Shaftesbury, a 17th century British writer, is famous for arguing that there is an epistemic component to humor, right? That we can only mock that which is false. And so he argued that everything should be open to mockery, because if you're incapable of actually mocking it, well, that probably tells us it's true. But if you can make fun of it, even the divine, and that's where he got himself into real trouble, he wasn't actually mocking God, but he was mocking the sort of evangelical uprising of his period. All right. So if you make fun of the religion and you can really get a zinger to stick, that's probably going to point to a flaw in that theological position. And so the idea here from Shaftesbury is everything ought to be open to humor. So as such, the other extreme is that there should be no prohibition on what jokes we tell. And there are three very different arguments given for this sort of open position. We can call them the Shakespearean, the nihilistic, and the cultural cohesive. The Shakespearean really does pull right from Shaftesbury, right? Ridicule is a test of truth, so nothing should be off limits because we need to be able to find truth everywhere, right? We need to be able to speak truth to power, and so power should always be under the microscope, whether it's science, whether it's religion. There should be no sacred cows. We call it Shakespearean because, right, in Shakespeare, it's often the fool who is the one who can speak the truth. So it is through humor that we will get to truth. And since we want truth everywhere, we should therefore not have any means of reining in what we joke about. The middle one, nihilist, is the argument that you will hear from working comedians. It's basically come on, it's a joke. Jokes have no meaning. They're just, they're fictional. They're very short stories. It's a joke. We're setting it aside. Maybe we're working inside of a play frame, but the idea is, I'm not saying that there's a pirate with a steering wheel on the front of his pants. It's just a setup, right? So there was a pirate with a steering wheel on the front of his pants, and I asked him, "What's that for?" He goes, it's driving me nuts." So I in no way intended that joke to contain any content about the nature of reality. It's a joke, right? There wasn't a chicken crossing the road. So anyone who's getting upset about the telling of these jokes is trying to take them as more than jokes. Jokes are merely a different kind of sort of epistemologically vacuous utterance, and so it shouldn't matter what we joke about. The last one, excuse me, is the view that we actually get from the anthropologists of humor. You see this in Christy Davis, you see this in Nicholas Oring. And what they argue is that what's interesting is that when we look at ethnic joke cycles in particular, so take Polish jokes, which really sort of swell in the American culture in the 1950s. It's not when you have the big wave of Polish immigrants, which is a generation to a generation and a half before. Those jokes show up when the kids who are no longer immigrants, but who now are assimilating and a part of normal life, now they are having the jokes told about them sort of as an indicator, a nudge, nudge that you have been accepted into the club, that you've earned your hyphen, you're Polish American, that you have the ability to maintain your identity, but you're still now one of the larger us. And so what they argue is that, we don't use humor to oppress, we use laws and violence to do that, right? When we go to the humor, what it actually is a very subtle signal of acceptance. That is, we make fun of, and this goes back to my family, we make fun of those we love. And so the cultural cohesive view says nothing should be off limits because to set a group aside as a sacred cow is basically to say you're never going to be part of us, right? You could think of it as, the kid who got picked last for the kickball team, right? The idea is you're not strong enough to play. Well, you are strong enough no matter who you are. And so these three positions all contend that morally there should be no prohibition on what jokes we tell. The central notion is what we'll call contextualism. So, where the cultural sensitivity position wants to say no tendentious jokes, the neo-Shakespearean view says anything goes. Here it's, well, some jokes by some people sometimes. And so the obvious question becomes who, when, and what, right? What's the context? When, how do we draw that line between those we can and those we can't? And there are, again, three different main positions here. The first one we can call the identity politics position. And this is the most prominent view outside of academia, which is that you can only make tendentious jokes about a group of which you are a member. So being Jewish, I can make Jewish jokes. Only an African American can make Black jokes. Only a queer person can make queer jokes. And the idea is that surely no one wants to harm themselves. So if I make a joke about my own people, I'm not making it in order to insult or harm, and so therefore it's allowable. But if I make a joke about any other group, our intentions are opaque. Why are you making that joke? And so the easiest way to draw the moral line is if you are one, you can joke about it. The second version, and this is probably the most popular contemporary view within the academy, is what we can call the humor as a sort of justice joke view. And so the idea here is that, yeah, humor can cause harm, but sometimes some people need to be hurt, right? If there is an unjust distribution of social power and some people have more privilege than they deserve, then you know what? We need to whack them, right? We should be able to use those jokes to knock them down a peg, right? In service of justice. And so the idea is that it is morally acceptable to punch up, but not punch down. To punch up is to take those who have undeserved privilege and bring them, to level the playing field, to bring them back down in line with us. But to punch down is bullying, that is to reinforce the unfair.
We seem to have lost the connection. Rather, he seems to have lost the connection. Yep. Well,
Whoa,
you're
am I
back.
back?
No problem.
So clearly advocates of the punching up and punching down view had issues with me bringing up these counterexamples. They are an intellectual mafia. No, there we go. And, like I say, it sounds exactly right. Tom Wilk, who is now a colleague of mine as an undergrad, was one of my students. And in the classroom, I will occasionally punch down. That is, I'm the professor, I'm the person in power. There are some students who I can make fun of in class, playfully mock. Not all of them, some of them. Who? Those with whom I have, a close relationship. Maybe somebody who's taken several classes with me, maybe somebody who's my advisee. And so it does seem like there would be some times in which punching down actually, in a certain sense, is a valuable thing. But again, there is an intuition here, right? One that needs to be kept. There's a reason why so many people buy this view. There are certain elements of it that we'll want to keep, even if the view itself, right? And we'll look at the end at the Dave Chappelle case. And so there's the third version, which we will simply call for ease, the correct view, which of course is the one that Tom and I put forward. And it's that everyone is fair game. But that doesn't mean that all jokes are allowed. The teller needs to have the requisite, and here's the important term that we came up with, joke capital. Okay, what does that mean? Well, we'll get there. We got about 3 slides first. So we work out this theory of joke capital in our book, In on the Joke. Tom was a double major when he was at Gettysburg with me, majoring in both philosophy and economics. And so as a result, excuse me, getting over a cold. As a result, the structure that we used was an economic one. Now, I had worked out a theory of humor ethics in my previous book, Isn't That Clever? And again, if you can, please have your libraries order both. I have 2 kids in grad school, so it would be very helpful. And in this book, in which I work out my picture of humor as playful cleverness, so it's a book on humor theory, what I tried to argue is that that picture of humor as playful cleverness gives rise to a humor ethic. And again, it has an insight we'll want to keep, but no, it didn't work. And so Tom and I tried to think, okay, how is it that we can fold the insight from that book into the insights from these other views and have something that is more comprehensive? So if you want to look contextually, what you see is that there's actually a whole lot of moving parts. This is what makes humor ethics really complicated, is that unlike, say, the cultural sensitivity position that really just wants to look at the joke is relevant, but we also need to look at who the target is, the history and social place of that target. We need to look at who the joker is. We need to look at the relationship between the joker and the target group. We need to look at the context, right? The setting in which the joke was told. And when you allow all of those independent variables to vary, there's a whole lot of combinations if you're going to come up with a contextualist theory. And so that was the trick. And so in order to sort of rein in this ethical chaos, we came up with a central metaphor that we used. Now, it comes from Ted Cohen's notion of joke intimacy. Now, the way Cohen works it out, and this will go back to my little spiel at the very beginning, what Cohen wants to argue is that when you meet a stranger and you share a laugh, the result of that laugh is a sort of interpersonal bond, almost as if you shared a meal, right? We want to see that notion of joke intimacy differently. So instead of, although we will talk about strangers, the idea is we're looking at joke intimacy as the ability to tell jokes about someone whom others couldn't make that same joke about. It demonstrates a sense of intimacy that you are comfortable with me making fun of you in that way, right? And so the idea here is there are certain jokes that you can tell about the people you're closest to. And if that's true, then that must be a relevant ethical factor in determining where this line is. And so the question then is, okay, how do you know what jokes you can and cannot tell? And so We start from the sort of rejection of nihilism, which is that, yeah, jokes can harm, right? Jokes can hurt. Anyone who's ever, trod the sand of the third grade playground knows that, some jokes really can harm. So joking has a risk associated with it. It is morally risky. And so what we were thinking is, okay, how would you have a sort of moral insurance against the indemnity of the moral harm you would create with the joke? Well, the idea is that different jokes are going to require different amounts of what we term joke capital as this moral hedge against its riskiness. So, how do you get it? What is it? Well, first we need to start from the other side. We can think of different jokes as having a particular cost, a price. Certain jokes are pricier than others. And we'll distinguish between the base price, the sticker price, and the out the door price. So, think of it in terms of buying a used car. The base price, and here's where, we're pulling from the sort of insight of the cultural sensitivity position. The base price of the joke is just looking at the harshness of the joke. There are jokes about any given particular group, some of which are gentle, others are much nastier. And so the base price of the joke, the starting point of this conversation, has to do with the inherent nastiness of the joke itself. Now, the cultural sensitivity position wants to say that's enough to cut off the conversation. That's where we disagree. But their concern has to be the starting point of this conversation. From there, we then go from the base price to the sticker price by making various adjustments, which we can think of in a certain sense as taxes, right? So a vulnerability tax, right? If a group is vulnerable, a harsh joke will cost more than the same harshness of a joke of a group that is less vulnerable, right? So if I wanted to make a gender joke, right? If I made a joke, given that we live in a patriarchal society, right? Jokes about women would be more expensive. If I asked, what do they call that useless piece of skin on the other side of a penis? A man. No one wants to say that men are, that's, well, okay, there are people who want to say men are oppressed, but those are usually the people doing the oppressing. The point is that the more vulnerable a group is, the more expensive that joke will be if we hold the harshness constant. There's a temporality tax. This is the too soon question, right? So if we're making a joke based on an event, the closer you are to the event, the more the joke would cost. This is why, if we look at Mel Brooks, right, having a Busby Berkeley style musical about the Spanish Inquisition, different from his Busby Berkeley piece about the Nazis, right? And notice it is about the Nazis, not about the Holocaust, right? And he even said in an interview that, he could make fun of Hitler, but what he couldn't do in the way that he made fun of the Spanish Inquisition was make fun of the Holocaust. Why? Temporality. And so the closer you are in time, the more expensive the joke is. The quality tax. And this is the one that comes from uh, the view in my earlier book. One of the things I tried to argue there is that because our intentions are opaque, when I make a joke about a group, right? Am I making this joke because I'm trying to, in a humorous way, express a hatred of them, to denigrate them? Or am I just telling a funny joke? So, I'm from Maryland. We have West Virginia as our neighbors, and so there are plenty of West Virginia jokes, right? How do you know the toothbrush was invented in West Virginia? Because if it was invented anywhere else, it'd be called the teeth brush. So the idea here is, well, can I tell that joke? Well, the funnier the joke is, the more likely it is that I told it because it's funny, not because it's harmful. If I told a biased joke that was really unfunny, hmm, why would you tell that joke? That's clearly not very funny. It must be because, and we make the inference, you're trying to express some sort of derogatory sense of that group. So the funnier a joke is, it will make it slightly less expensive. The less funny, more expensive. And finally, the supply tax. So unlike normal economics, where more supply makes something cheaper, in the case of humor, if there are lots and lots of jokes about a group, that actually elevates the price. Because now what are you doing by telling yet another Polish joke is you're further instantiating this sort of belief about them. Whereas if it's a group that doesn't often get a joke made of them or a joke made about them in a particular way, then that joke is going to be cheaper. So, there's a Australian joke. How do you know a plane full of Brits has landed? Because the engine has stopped, but the whining continues. Which in America, we have the stereotype of the Brit as a stiff upper lip. Clearly, it's a very different stereotype. And so in America, that joke will be cheaper because it's not going to have the same harm because it doesn't really play into the pre-existing stereotype in any way. And so we're not saying these are the only four taxes, but these are the sorts of components that one thinks of when one moves from the base price, which is just a function of the script itself and its harshness, to looking at contextual elements of the target, right? So here we're just looking at whom the joke is about and their sort of historical relation or set of relations. But notice what's lacking, any sense of the Joker. And so that's when we finally get to, well, joke capital. Okay. So the idea here is that you can think of joke capital as money. And we all have these humorous savings accounts. And each group has joke capital in their particular denomination. And you will have in your savings different amounts in these different denominations. Now, there is no exchange. I can't say, okay, well, I've got an excess of joke capital about Scots. Can I trade it in for joke capital about queer people? No, you can't trade, right? So these are non-transferable. So how do you get this joke capital? And the idea is that if you would have enough joke capital, you could then be insured against the harm and you could tell the joke. So how do you get the joke capital? Well, one way is to inherit it. And here's where the identity politics insight comes into being, right? We do get extra leeway telling jokes about groups of which we're a part. Why? Because we inherit a lot of joke capital about, from groups we belong to. The idea, it's not infinite. There may still be some jokes that are just, whoa, no, 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 no. Nobody should tell that joke. But you get much more leeway. So you start off with a tremendous amount of joke capital, according to all the vectors of diversity that are packed into your intersectional identity. So whatever groups you are a part of, you have a significant amount of joke capital in all of those denominations. But you can also earn it. That is, if you don't belong to the group, but you have demonstrated a strong commitment to them. So I am a straight cis male, but if I work tirelessly for the queer community, that gives me a little bit longer leash than most people to make jokes about that community, right? Why? Because I've shown my commitment to them. And as such, I get a little bit of joke capital that allows me to make jokes that I otherwise wouldn't have. So you can earn it. Similarly, in certain circumstances, you can borrow it, right? And the idea is this is usually only, and we'll talk about this in a minute, if you're sort of alone with a dear friend, right? We often, bust on each other, so, I have a dear friend in the Italian department here, right? And we'll make Jewish and Italian jokes, and we can make jokes about the other because of our intimate relationship. And so, in that sense, I can borrow his capital for the sake of the joke to him about him. Now, it doesn't necessarily work in general. This is why oh, well, I have friends who are excuse does not work. So you can only lend it within certain confines, but there is that dynamic. And finally, there's reparations. So if you have one group that has historically oppressed another group, then the oppressed group gets a significant amount of joke capital in the denomination of the oppressor. And so, you can see, oppressed minorities have now the ability to morally make much harsher jokes than those who are on the other side historically. And so through these mechanisms, you then have the amount that would be in your savings accounts. And if you have enough in your account for this kind of joke based on this target, then you could tell the joke, right? You now have the joke capital to cover the cost. But there's one part that's missing, right? One element of the context that's not yet a part of the conversation, and that's the setting. So different joking contexts will change the price of the joke. So this is where we go from base price to sticker price to out the door price, right? So if you walk on the used car lot, here's how much they say the car would be. Here is our price on the sticker, but then you have, the used car salesman say, I can put you on the road for this. So this is that last piece. And we look at a range of different joking contexts and argue that it actually changes the calculation in really important ways. So if I'm joking with friends, that is somebody with whom I am very deeply connected, right? That knowledge of the other grants me a certain latitude, right? If there wasn't care, I wouldn't be that connected to you. And so as a result, there is an additional sort of decrease in the cost of the joke. It also allows me, as we mentioned, a minute ago, the ability to borrow somebody's joke capital within the confines of that relationship. So that other person would have to have the joke capital in order to lend it to the friend who wanted to make the joke to them. But the idea is that that only holds within the friendship. Now, it's one thing if you're, say, in somebody's basement having a couple of beers. Well, what if you're at the corner bar and you could be overheard? Does that change the context? Where is there a presumption of privacy? These are all interesting questions that arise within this context of joking with friends. But suppose the person isn't a friend. Suppose it's an acquaintance, somebody you know, but you don't have that intimacy with them. Okay. Now that's clearly going to change the price of the joke. On the one hand, moving from an acquaintance to a friend, from acquaintanceship to friendship, is a moral positive. So there is a reason to want to perhaps push that boundary a little bit, but at the same time, it comes with risk. And then there is joking with strangers, which you would think would be a straightforward generalization of joking with acquaintances, but it actually isn't, because largely with strangers, there isn't even the promise of a relationship beyond the moment. And so how does that temporality, that limitedness, play into the morality of the interaction? It's a very different notion when we look at professional comedians, right? So you go into a comedy club. You expect certain jokes, especially at certain clubs. You know there's a social contract. You go to this club knowing you are going to hear a certain level of harshness of humor that you don't often hear. As a result, you can think of the professional comedian as receiving a sort of grant, right? By virtue of being on that stage, they now have extra freedom to make jokes they otherwise couldn't make. Why? Because you paid your cover charge. You walked in with the acknowledgement that this is the sort of thing I am seeking out. And so there is an arrangement. Now, this gets more complicated when we have other modes of distribution. So, a comedy album. Back in the old days, we had these things called records, right? And so you would have to go to the record store and you would look through the bin and take up the album and you would buy it, then you would put it on your turntable. Again, you bought the album, but now you can turn on Sirius XM. Okay. Does the fact that it's broadcast change the amount of the grant? So, what is the relationship? Suppose you're doing a stand-up show at a college. Suppose you're doing a stand-up show at a house of worship. How does the context of the professional comedy show vary the amount of joke capital given to the comedian? And finally, there's online joking. And so in the case of online joking, what we see is an oddity because normally I hear a joke, I remember a joke, I tell the joke, but I tell the joke my way. What's interesting online with the meme is it is literally directly copyable an infinite number of times and without any loss. I mean, we all know people who just can't tell a joke. They heard a good joke, they butcher it. But in the case of forwarding an email or posting a meme, you have the joke. Now, what that means is I may have intended this for a particular audience, but it may be in a radically unchanged way distributed well beyond that initial group. How does that play into the ethical requirements? Now, all of these are interesting questions, which if I had more time, I could answer, but then you wouldn't have to buy the book. And again, I have two kids in grad school. So let's quickly just run through a couple of cases which appeal to intuitions and show how this view can clearly make sense of them, which should stand as some sort of evidence that this is a valuable way of looking at humor ethics. The first comes from Reed Richter, who says, imagine an island populated entirely by bigots. So you have an island out in the middle of nowhere. No one's coming on the island. No one's getting off the island, completely populated by racists. They tell racist jokes to each other because that's what racists do. Is there a moral problem with them telling those jokes? Now, if we want to be like John Morial, a sort of utilitarian about, that, look, jokes cause harm. Well, they're not causing any harm. Their jokes aren't changing how racist the island of racists is, and it's not leaving the island. So in that sense, those jokes have no negative ramifications. Yet, I think the intuition, hopefully, that we all share is, yeah, that's still not a good thing for them to do. Why? Well, we now can explain that, right? These are people who do not have explicitly the joke capital to tell those sorts of jokes. And so here we have a position that for any sort of consequentialist view of humor ethics is going to be a problem, but for our view, it isn't. Let's look at the Dave Chappelle case, right? Here's a professional comedian who had made his way doing racial humor, who in his last couple of specials has turned his focus to the trans community. And his initial justification, so he's justified it different ways at different times. But one of them, interestingly, is he's saying, look, no, I'm punching up. And the people who are most opposed to him are the ones who are often most wedded to the punching up, punching down. And he said, look, if you look at the trans community, these are by and large educated, well-off, people, right? And they have gotten, their uh, interests in front of the community in ways that, Black Americans haven't, despite having pushed for, a century and a half. So he's like, I'm punching up. And they'll say, well, look, no, 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 no. It's not that you're making trans jokes as a Black American. You're making trans jokes as a straight man. Okay. Well, how do we know which vector of identity the joke is coming from? Right? And punching up, punching down, do we have a great chain of suffering? How do we know who is above and who is below? So the intuition, I think, is a good one, but the mechanism doesn't work. But for us, all of a sudden it's perfectly clear. Does Chappelle have the joke capital in the trans denomination? No. And so, no, you can't tell that joke. So now we don't have to worry about the sorts of problems that were confounding the punching up, punching down, but we keep their intuition. We make, in essence, the argument they hope to make, but it now can be grounded in a way that's clean. And the last one is the American comedian Natasha Leggero. There was a bit of a dust up several years ago uh, when the American brand SpaghettiOs, and I have to apologize to Sal for this, it's a horrible product of oversweet, mushy uh, pasta circles. And they put out a tweet in honor of World War II veterans. And she responded to the tweet saying, isn't that something that, the only food they can chew is trying to ride on their coattails? And she got all sorts of, guff from those saying, it is a horrible indignity for you to make fun of these, brave veterans who fought in a war. And the intuition is, well, wait a minute, this is ginned up political outrage. And she didn't apologize, to her credit. And we can now explain why she shouldn't have, because you couldn't imagine a cheaper joke, right? Think about the harshness. All it's saying is that World War II veterans are old. Older people have dentures. Older people can only eat soft food. That's hardly an insult to them, right? And so the idea is we can now explain in terms of joke capital and the price of the joke as to why there should not have been a dust up where there was. And so those are just three cases. And if you have others, I would be more than happy to chat about them.